The first rays of sunlight painted the Kansas plains in shades of amber and gold as lonely rancher stepped onto his weathered porch, coffee cup in hand. At 43, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. The wind carried the familiar scents of sage and distant cattle, but something else caught his attention: the soft sound of whimpering. There, huddled against his front door like a wounded animal, was a boy no older than 8. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face streaked with tears and dust. Dark bruises marked his thin arms, and his eyes held a fear that made the rancher's chest tighten with recognition. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." "Easy there, son," the rancher said, his voice gentle despite its gravelly texture. He knelt slowly, making himself less imposing. "What's your name?" The boy looked up with startling blue eyes. "Tommy," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "Well, Tommy, looks like you've had a rough night. How about we get you cleaned up and fed?" Inside his modest cabin, the rancher watched as Tommy devoured a plate of eggs and bacon with desperate hunger. The boy's hands shook as he ate, and he kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. "Who hurt you, Tommy?" the rancher asked carefully, refilling the boy's glass of milk. Tommy's fork clattered to his plate. "I can't tell," he said, tears welling in his eyes. "He said he'd kill me if I told anyone. He said nobody would believe me anyway." The rancher's jaw clenched. He'd seen enough broken children in his time to recognize the signs. "You're safe here, son. Nobody's going to hurt you while you're under my roof." But even as he spoke those words, the rancher knew that safety in Dodge City was a fragile thing. The town had a way of devouring secrets and spitting out consequences that no one expected. By midday, word had already spread through Dodge City's dusty streets. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had seen the boy through the rancher's window. Sheriff Morrison had ridden out to investigate after receiving reports of a suspicious situation at the isolated ranch. "Afternoon, rancher," Sheriff Morrison called out as he dismounted his horse. Behind him rode 3 other men: Mayor Caldwell, Judge Patterson, and Dr. Whitmore, the town's most influential citizens. "Sheriff," the rancher replied, stepping onto his porch. He could see Tommy peeking through the window, and he positioned himself to block their view. "We've heard you've got a boy here," Mayor Caldwell said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting answers. "Folks are asking. Questions about where he came from? Boy needed help. I gave it to him." Judge Patterson, a stern man with silver hair and cold eyes, stepped forward. "That's commendable, but we need to know who this child belongs to. There are proper procedures for handling abandoned children." "He's not abandoned," the rancher said firmly. "He's under my protection." Dr. Whitmore, who served as both physician and unofficial moral authority of the town, cleared his throat. "We can see the boy has been injured. If there's been a crime committed, we need to know the details." The rancher's eyes hardened. "The boy will speak when he's ready. Until then, he stays with me." Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably. He'd known the rancher for years and respected him, but the pressure from the town's elite was mounting. "Look, we all want what's best for the child, but people are talking. They want to know who the father is, why the boy came to you specifically." Sometimes a man's business is his own," the rancher replied. As the delegation rode away, the rancher could see the storm clouds gathering, not in the sky, but in the determined expressions of men who weren't accustomed to being denied answers. He knew that by evening, every saloon in Dodge City would be buzzing with speculation and suspicion. That night, as Tommy slept fitfully on the small cot the rancher had prepared, the older man sat by the window, rifle across his knees. He'd made a promise to protect the boy, but he knew the cost of keeping that promise was about to become very high indeed. Through the darkness, he could see the distant lights of Dodge City flickering like angry stars. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more pressure, and more danger. But tonight, a frightened child slept safely under his roof, and that was enough to steel his resolve for whatever was coming. The rancher closed his eyes and remembered another child, another time, Another promise he'd failed to keep. This time would be different. This time, he wouldn't let them down. The next morning brought more than just sunrise to the rancher's property. A crowd of nearly 30 townspeople had gathered at his gate, their faces set with the grim determination of a community that had made up its collective mind. Leading them were the same 4 men from yesterday, but now they carried the weight of public opinion behind them. Tommy pressed against the window, his small body trembling as he watched the assembly. "They're here for me, aren't they?" he whispered. The rancher placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "They're here because they're scared of what they don't understand. But I won't let them take you." Sheriff Morrison approached the porch alone, his badge catching the morning light. "Rancher, we need to talk. The whole town's in an uproar." "About what?" "About that boy. People are saying all kinds of things. That he's the illegitimate son of someone important, that there's been a cover-up, that you're hiding something criminal." Morrison removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "Judge Patterson called an emergency town meeting last night. They've made a decision." The rancher's eyes narrowed. "What kind of decision?" "You have until sunset today to reveal the boy's parentage and the circumstances of his arrival. If you don't—" Morrison paused, clearly uncomfortable with his next words. "They're voting to banish both of you from Dodge City. Anyone who helps you after that will face the same fate." "On whose authority?" "The town council voted unanimously. Judge Patterson says it's within their rights to protect the community from potential threats." From the crowd, Mayor Caldwell's voice boomed across the yard. "We know you can hear us, rancher. This isn't just about the boy anymore. This is about trust, about being part of a community. We have a right to know what kind of danger you might be bringing to our families." Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "At minimum, let me examine the child. Those injuries need proper attention, and I can determine if there's been criminal activity." The rancher's jaw tightened. He knew what the doctor was really asking, and the thought made his blood boil. "The boy's injuries are healing fine. He doesn't need your examination. That's not your decision to make." Judge Patterson's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "You're not his legal guardian. You have no right to make medical decisions for him." Mrs. Henderson from the general store pushed forward, her face flushed with righteous indignation. "My husband thinks the boy might be the result of some scandal involving the Worthington family. They've been acting strange lately, and their youngest son hasn't been seen in town for weeks." "That's ridiculous speculation," called out Tom Bradley, the blacksmith. "I heard it might be connected to that traveling preacher who came through last month. There were rumors about him and some of the local women." The crowd began to murmur and argue among themselves, theories flying like sparks from a campfire. Each suggestion grew more outlandish than the last, but the rancher could see the dangerous undercurrent running through them all, the need to blame someone, to find a villain in their midst. "Enough!" The rancher's voice cut through the chaos. "You want to know the truth? The truth is that a child came to me for help and I gave it. That's all you need to know." Judge Patterson stepped closer to the porch, his eyes cold and calculating. "That's not nearly enough, I'm afraid. You see, rancher, we've done some investigating of our own. We know about your past, about what happened in Colorado before you came here." The rancher's blood ran cold. He'd hoped that part of his life would stay buried. "We know about the accusations," Patterson continued, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "About the children who went missing, about the questions that were never answered. Some folks are starting to wonder if history might be repeating itself." "Those charges were dropped," the rancher said through gritted teeth. "I was cleared of any wrongdoing." "Cleared, yes, but never truly exonerated in the court of public opinion." Patterson smiled coldly. "Which is why this situation is so concerning. A mysterious child appears at your door and you refuse to explain where he came from. Can you understand why that might make people nervous?" Behind him, the rancher could hear Tommy's sharp intake of breath. The boy was old enough to understand the implications of what was being said. Sheriff Morrison looked genuinely pained. "Rancher, I've known you for 5 years. I don't believe you'd hurt a child. But these people are scared, and scared people do dangerous things. Give them something, anything, to calm their fears." The rancher looked out at the crowd, seeing neighbors he'd helped during harsh winters, people whose cattle he'd rescued from floods, families he'd quietly supported during difficult times. Now they stared at him with suspicion and fear, ready to cast him out based on whispers and half-remembered gossip. "I understand your concerns," he said finally, his voice carrying across the yard. "But I won't betray a child's trust to satisfy your curiosity. If that makes me unwelcome in your town, so be it." Judge Patterson nodded as if he'd expected this response. "Very well. You have until sunset. After that, you and the boy will be considered trespassers on community land. Anyone who provides you with food, shelter, or assistance will face the same banishment." As the crowd began to disperse, their voices carrying threats and speculation back toward town, the rancher felt the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. He'd chosen to protect Tommy, but in doing so, he'd made enemies of an entire community. That afternoon, as he watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, the rancher began to prepare for exile. But deep in his heart, he knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test not just his resolve, but the very soul of Dodge City itself. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the dusty landscape, an unexpected visitor arrived at the rancher's property. Sarah Mitchell, the town's schoolteacher, approached on foot, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Her presence surprised the rancher. Sarah was known for her propriety and strict adherence to social expectations. "Miss Mitchell," the rancher said, stepping onto his porch, "you shouldn't be here. You heard what Judge Patterson said about helping us." Sarah's green eyes flashed with determination. "I heard what he said, and I also heard what he didn't say." She climbed the porch steps, her long skirt rustling against the wooden boards. "I brought food for the boy, and I have something important to tell you." Inside the cabin, Tommy looked up from the book the rancher had given him, a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. Sarah knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "Hello, Tommy. I'm Miss Mitchell. I teach at the school in town." Tommy's eyes widened. "Are you going to make me go back?" "No, sweetheart. I'm here to help." Sarah reached into her basket and pulled out fresh bread, cheese, and a jar of preserves. "But I need you to be very brave and tell me something. The man who hurt you, did he wear a special ring, a gold ring with a red stone?" Tommy's face went pale and he nodded slowly. "How did you know?" Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with the rancher. "Because I've seen that ring before, and I know who wears it." The rancher felt his stomach drop. "Who?" "Judge Patterson." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The rancher sank into his chair, the full implications crashing over him like a wave. "That's why he's so determined to get the boy back. He's not protecting the community. He's protecting himself." Sarah nodded grimly. "There's more. Tommy isn't the first child to disappear from families that have crossed the judge. Over the past 2 years, 3 other children have vanished, always from families who couldn't pay their debts or who challenged his authority. Where are they now? I don't know, but I have my suspicions." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "There's an old mining camp about 20 miles north of here. It's been abandoned for years, but lately some of the cowboys have reported seeing smoke coming from that direction." Tommy tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "There were other kids there," he said quietly. "In the dark place where he kept me. I heard them crying at night." The rancher's hands clenched into fists. "We have to get them out." "It's not that simple," Sarah warned. "Judge Patterson owns half the businesses in town. Sheriff Morrison owes him money. Dr. Whitmore is his brother-in-law. Even Mayor Caldwell is afraid of him." "Then how did Tommy escape?" Tommy spoke up, his voice stronger now. "There was a lady. She worked in the kitchen. She said she had a little boy once, and she couldn't watch anymore. She helped me get away in the night and told me to find the lonely man who lived by himself. She said he was the only one who might help." "What lady?" Sarah asked gently. "She had yellow hair and sad eyes. She said her name was Mary." Sarah gasped. "Mary Hutchinson. She disappeared 6 months ago after her husband died and left her with debts to Judge Patterson. Everyone assumed she'd left town in shame." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, painting a picture more horrifying than the rancher had imagined. Judge Patterson wasn't just corrupt. He was running some kind of operation using vulnerable children and desperate adults. "We need proof," the rancher said. "Something that will make the townspeople believe us." Sarah reached into her basket again and pulled out a small leather journal. "I've been keeping records, documenting every strange disappearance, every family that's been ruined by the judge's legal decisions. But you're right, we need more than suspicions." A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see a lone rider approaching at full gallop. As the figure drew closer, they recognized Sheriff Morrison. But something was different about his posture, urgent, almost desperate. Morrison dismounted quickly and rushed to the porch. "Rancher, we've got trouble. Judge Patterson has convinced Mayor Caldwell to form a posse. They're planning to come for the boy at sunset, with or without your cooperation." "How many men?" the rancher asked. 15, maybe 20. "And they're armed." Morrison's face was grim. "But that's not the worst part. I overheard Patterson talking to Dr. Whitmore. They're planning to claim the boy is mentally disturbed, that he's been making up stories about abuse. They want to have him committed to the state asylum." Sarah stood up abruptly. "They can't do that." "They can if they claim he's a danger to himself and others. And once he's in that asylum—" Morrison didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew that children who went into the state asylum rarely came out. The rancher looked at Tommy, who had gone very quiet and pale. The boy understood enough to know that his time was running out. "There's something else," Morrison continued. "I've been doing some investigating of my own. That mining camp Sarah mentioned? I rode out there yesterday. There are definitely people there. I saw lights and heard voices, but the place is heavily guarded. We have to try," the rancher said. "If there are other children there, we can't abandon them." Sarah nodded. "I'll go back to town and try to rally support. There are good people in Dodge City, people who would stand up to Patterson if they knew the truth. Be careful," the rancher warned. "If Patterson suspects you know something, you'll disappear too." As Sarah prepared to leave, she turned back to Tommy. "You're very brave, sweetheart. What you're doing, telling the truth, it's going to help a lot of other children." Tommy nodded solemnly. "Will you make sure the lady with yellow hair is okay? She saved me." "I promise," Sarah said, though her eyes showed the weight of that promise. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, the rancher began to formulate a desperate plan. He had less than 4 hours before the posse arrived, and in that time, he needed to rescue the other children, expose Judge Patterson's crimes, and somehow survive the confrontation that was coming. The stakes had never been higher, and failure would mean not just his own destruction, but the continued suffering of innocent children trapped in a nightmare of corruption and abuse. As the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, the rancher made his decision. He couldn't wait for the posse to arrive. He had to act now, while there was still time to save the other children. "Tommy," he said, kneeling beside the boy, "I need you to be very brave. We're going to help your friends, but it's going to be dangerous." Tommy's blue eyes were steady and determined. "I want to help. They're scared, just like I was." Sheriff Morrison had agreed to help, despite the risk to his own position. "I've been wearing this badge for 10 years, he'd said. "If I can't use it to protect children, what good is it?" The 3 men, the rancher, Morrison, and Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, who had quietly joined their cause, rode hard toward the abandoned mining camp as darkness fell. Behind them, Sarah Mitchell was working her own kind of magic in town, going door to door, sharing the truth with families she trusted. The mining camp sat in a hollow between 2 hills, its ramshackle buildings barely visible in the moonlight. Smoke indeed rose from several chimneys, and they could see guards posted at strategic points around the perimeter. "There," Morrison whispered, pointing to a large building that had once housed the mine's equipment. "That's where the lights are strongest." They approached carefully, using the shadows and abandoned mining equipment as cover. As they drew closer, they could hear voices, children's voices, weak and frightened. The rancher's heart clenched as he recognized the sound of suffering he'd hoped never to hear again. Memories of Colorado flooded back. Another mining town, another group of children he'd failed to save in time. But this time would be different. They found Mary Hutchinson first, huddled in a small shack near the main building. Her once golden hair was now dull and matted, her face gaunt with hunger and despair. When she saw them, she nearly cried out in surprise before Morrison quickly covered her mouth. "We're here to help," he whispered. "How many children?" "7," she breathed. "7 children in the main building. There are 4 guards, and Judge Patterson is here tonight. He comes every few days to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Where are the keys?" "Patterson keeps them, but there's a loose board on the back wall. I've been working on it for weeks, hoping to help them escape." While Morrison and Bradley created a distraction by setting fire to an empty building on the far side of camp, the rancher and Mary worked to free the children. One by one, they pulled frightened, malnourished kids through the gap in the wall. 3 boys and 4 girls, ranging in age from 6 to 12. Among them was a girl who looked remarkably like Tommy. "That's my sister Emma," Tommy whispered when he saw her. "I thought she was dead." The reunion was brief but powerful. Emma clung to her brother, tears streaming down her face. "Tommy told the truth," she whispered to the rancher. "He tried to protect me, but the judge said no one would believe us because we're just orphans." As they prepared to leave with the children, Judge Patterson himself appeared, flanked by 2 armed men. His face was twisted with rage and desperation. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled at the rancher. "These children are better off here than on the streets. I'm providing them with shelter, with purpose." "Purpose?" The rancher's voice was deadly quiet. "What purpose could justify what you've done to them? They work the mine. They earn their keep. It's more than they'd get anywhere else." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his badge glinting in the firelight from the burning building. "Judge Patterson, you're under arrest for kidnapping, child abuse, and conspiracy." Patterson laughed bitterly. "With what authority? I own this county, Morrison." "Own you." "Not anymore." The voice came from behind Patterson. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the shadows, followed by a group of 20 townspeople, including Mayor Caldwell, Dr. Whitmore, and many of the families who had lost children. "We know the truth now," Mayor Caldwell said, his voice heavy with shame. "Sarah showed us the evidence, and these children have confirmed it. You're finished, Patterson." Dr. Whitmore, his face pale with shock, knelt beside the rescued children. "My God, what have we allowed to happen? These children need immediate medical attention." The confrontation that followed was swift but decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of 7 children, Judge Patterson's supporters melted away. His guards surrendered without a fight, and the corrupt judge found himself in shackles, facing a justice he had perverted for so long. As dawn broke over Dodge City, the rancher sat on his porch with Tommy and Emma beside him. The other rescued children were being cared for by families in town, and Mary Hutchinson was receiving the medical attention she desperately needed. Sheriff Morrison approached, looking exhausted but relieved. "The territorial marshal is on his way to take Patterson into custody. He'll face federal charges for what he's done." "What about the children?" "That's the best part," Sarah said, joining them on the porch. "The Hendersons want to adopt 2 of the younger ones. The Bradleys are taking in the oldest boy. And Emma," she smiled at the girl, "Emma and Tommy are going to stay with the Caldwells. The mayor feels responsible for what happened, and he wants to make amends." Tommy looked up at the rancher with worried eyes. "But what about you? You saved us. Don't you want us to stay with you?" The rancher's throat tightened with emotion. "Tommy, you and Emma deserve a real family, people who can give you the love and stability you need. The Caldwells are good people. Will we still see you?" "Every day if you want. I'm not going anywhere." As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the plains in golden light, the rancher reflected on the events of the past few days. He had come to Dodge City seeking solitude, trying to escape the ghosts of his past. Instead, he had found redemption in the most unexpected way, by protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The town of Dodge City had learned a hard lesson about the danger of blind trust in authority and the importance of listening to the voices of the vulnerable. But they had also discovered the power of community when it stands united for justice. Tommy and Emma would grow up in a town that had been forever changed by their courage to speak the truth. And the rancher, no longer quite so lonely, had found his purpose in ensuring that no child would ever again suffer in silence while he had the power to help. As the children ran off to explore their new life, the rancher smiled and settled back in his chair. The past could not be changed, but the future, bright with possibility and hope, stretched out before them all like the endless Kansas sky. The lonely rancher was lonely no more, and Dodge City had found its soul. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.